Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is another spine-tingling tale from the incredible CreepyAus. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR? And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled I Got Lost in the Bush when I was 8. I think I've started remembering what happened. Let's get straight into that. It's been over 20 years since I got lost on a family camping trip, and for all of them, that time in my life has been a complete blank. Or that is, until a few months ago. A few months ago? Well, to explain that, I have to first go back to 1997. When I was a little kid, we lived in Tasmania for a long while. Even now the island state is one of the least populated and wildest in Australia. But back in the 90s, that statement carried even more truth. Hobart had yet to undergo the rapid growth of the last decade or so. The wine industry hadn't exploded yet, and it hadn't quite kicked off as a destination for tourists yet either. In 1997, Tasmania was a pretty, sleepy, rugged green gem full of wild mystery, and my dad made it his unofficial mission to explore as much of that as he could. He and Mum used to go on week-long hikes through the wilderness, trekking into places that might never have been seen by human eyes. And of course, when I came along, they had to seriously cut back. But no matter how beautiful the bush might be, it's not the place for a young baby, especially in a part of the country where the temperature can suddenly drop below zero, even in the middle of January. Well, they still hiked with me in a carrier on Dad's back, but they never stayed out with me there. The most they could manage until I turned 6 or 7 were some weekend trips, when I spent the time eating ice cream and watching Disney movies with my grandparents. It must have been early 1996 by the time they were willing to take me with them. They still stuck to short trips, but I wasn't the type of kid to wander off, and their confidence slowly grew. Until November of 1997, when I went missing. We had driven up to Stanley for a short 4 or 5 day break. They took me up to the famous Nut on the first day, and then early next morning we drove to a trailhead in the Tarkine wilderness for a relatively simple 3-day hike. I was young and I don't remember a lot, but they always told me that I wandered off while they were setting up camp on the second day. I had never once done anything like that in all of our time out in the bush. Dad could never understand it, but I suppose parents sometimes just don't want to face the truth of it, which seemed to be that they had a lapse in concentration and let me out of their sight. That's not to criticize them in any way either. Kids will be kids, and I certainly never blamed them for any of it. And besides, everything turned out okay in the end. Or so I thought for 20-odd years, anyway. I must admit that there has always been an element of mystery surrounding how I came to be rescued. All told, I'd been missing for 5 days when I wandered into a clearing where an older couple had set up their caravan. A child surviving 5 full days in the wilderness. Though heavy rain and single-figure temperatures is rare, but not unheard of, and not what makes my story strange. No. The weirdness kicks in when you consider that the campsite I had wandered into was close to the Savage River National Park, some 80 kilometers or more from where I went missing. And somehow, an 8-year-old girl had managed to cross that distance in 5 days, at times through heavy rain and nocturnal temperatures below 5 degrees, without food or water, and in some of the most unspoilt and rugged wilderness in the world. And stranger still, I showed no signs of exposure, no signs of dehydration or hunger. My clothes were a little dirty, but I could have just walked straight out of my house, they said. I also had absolutely no memory of the time that I'd been missing. And when I saw the old couple, I apparently said, "Excuse me, have you seen my mummy or daddy? Oh, they were just over there, but now I can't see them." And the police basically said they had two leading theories. Either I had been taken in by someone who didn't want to be found, maybe an illegal hunter or trapper, and delivered to safety in secret. Or I had been snatched by someone who had a change of mind for whatever reason. Neither line of investigation ever led to anywhere in my knowledge, and my parents hardly cared. They had me back. My parents stopped hiking until I grew up. I suppose they were protective of me, which is understandable. Even when they went back into the bush, they said they didn't have the same feeling anymore. Dad eventually took a job in Canberra when I was 15, and we moved away from the rugged country that he once loved so much. On the other hand, I grew up with the affinity for the wilderness, and once I turned 16 and had a bit of sense, I spent a bunch of time hiking around Canberra and sometimes the south coast or snowy mountains. It's no tycoon, but I still enjoyed it. Eventually, though, I went to uni. I had boyfriends and I got a job. And I didn't have time to spare trekking through the bush. I also spent 5 years trying to remember what happened to me over those 5 days. And beyond curiosity and the frustration of not remembering, I couldn't help but feel it was important for me to remember for some other reason. One I couldn't quite grasp. I tried everything, up to and including hypnosis, to no avail. After a while, I just accepted that it will always be a mystery. I didn't even think about my dreams, honestly. I've never really remembered one. I mean, I get snatches here and there, obviously, but I genuinely never made the connection. I had always had nightmares like a normal person, but I never remembered anything more than the emotion that they created. Late last year, that changed. It happened completely by accident. I had been having trouble sleeping. I had been sleepwalking, and I kept waking up at odd hours and being unable to get back to sleep. And so my therapist suggested a sleep diary. I started out by writing it down, but that meant turning on the light in the middle of the night, which honestly disrupted my sleep as much as whatever underlying issue I might have had. And so, instead, I started recording it on my phone. And that's how I discovered that, late at night and half awake, I could recount my dreams for a few moments before my brain fully kicked into gear and they were gone. The first time I heard myself talking about a dream, I actually felt quite excited. I sort of felt like I'd been missing out, and now I might at least get some insight into what I dreamt about. Even the nightmares I talked about intrigued me. That is, until I had the nightmare about the forest. That recording and a couple since set me on a terrifying path that I should never have started down. But I did, and I can't change that. And I'm sorry. Sleep recording 36. It's, I don't know, 3-something in the morning? I can't see the numbers on the clock properly. I had another nightmare about some kind of forest this time, but it was like no forest I've ever seen. I don't know if everything was huge or if I shrank somehow. The ground was covered in this thick red moss and the air smelled sweet, but not a nice sweet. Rank sweet, like spoiled meat. The sky was dark, but there was light, which didn't make any sense. Even the trees were strange. They were so tall, all gnarly and twisted, and the leaves were an odd colour, like a eucalypt but with a touch of purple. And, as I looked at the trees, I noticed that the shadows underneath them were moving, like smoke or something. I was suddenly terrified. I felt like the darkness was full of eyes, watching me, and they weren't friendly. I turned and ran, and I could have sworn I heard something behind me, whispering, almost following me. And then I tripped and fell into the moss. I was wet and spongy. I pulled my hands away and realized that the moss wasn't red. It was soaked with something red. I think blood. Lying in the moss, I could see it was writhing with creatures of some kind. I couldn't make them out, but the mats of moss moved with them. A shadow then fell over me, and I turned around and I'm not sure what it was, but I screamed, and that's when I woke up. Normally, my descriptions of nightmares didn't affect me at all, but this one, felt different. It's like it jarred loose a memory inside of me somehow. I remembered the moss, and not just from the dream either. I remembered how it felt, kind of sticky, and I remembered the smell. It was just a flash, but I knew it wasn't a snippet of a dream, or at least not a normal dream. More than anything, I remembered terror, more than the terror of a nightmare. Real, gut-wrenching terror like I had never felt before, yet somehow familiar. I had no doubt that nightmare had been more than a nightmare. And I started to wonder if it had anything to do with my disappearance as a child. And it suddenly wasn't anything that I remembered otherwise. I mentioned it to my therapist, although I left out the really weird stuff. She frowned as I spoke, especially when I talked about how I somehow felt like it must have been real. And then she talked about something called dissociative memory. And basically, she talked about how repressed memories are more complex than just being memories that our brain tries to make us forget. Instead of being forced down below the surface, like the movies would have you believe, traumatic memories at a young age are often recorded by our brain in flashes and snippets, pieces of imagery or emotion that are more like chopped up pieces of a film than a proper memory. Add years to the equation and they start to feel distant, unreal, and even if you do remember them, these memories can feel like dreams. And not only that, but they can bubble up as dreams during times of stress, fatigue, or intense brain activity. She wondered whether my dream had in fact been a dissociative memory. Given what I had left out, the thought made me feel slightly sick. She made me promise to mention it if I had any other similar dreams, and a few weeks later, I did. Sleep Journal 51. It happened again. It's 4:43 in the morning and I'm awake and don't know if I'll be able to go back to sleep. I dreamt about the forest again, the blood forest, but this time, it was even worse. I was in the forest, surrounded by the trees. They were even bigger up close. They looked as wide as a building. Even though I think I was little again, they must still have been bigger than any trees I'd ever seen. Or maybe they aren't. Maybe I've seen those exact trees before. Anyway, this time I was huddled under a tree root or something. I was hiding, but from what, I'm not sure. I just knew that there was a monster out there and I had to hide. The ground underneath me was just dirt, no moss, and I could see all of the creeping, crawling things moving in and out of the moss in front of where I was hiding. They had so many legs, like a whole bunch of millipedes and centipedes, but they were the size of snakes. The moss itself was so much thicker than I looked from the top, thicker than I was tall, and the crawling things scuppered around underneath it. The red fluid, the blood, soaked all the way through. All around me there was a whispering sound, but loud. It felt like hundreds of people whispering right into my ear, but there was no one anywhere nearby, and they weren't speaking any language I'd ever heard. And then something moved outside of my hidey hole. I couldn't make out any details. My eyes were too full of tears and too blurry from being rubbed, but it was big. Not a natural animal. I could see it move, but I couldn't make out the shape. I just knew that it was big, and I had to stay hidden from it. I wonder if that was a thing I almost saw in the last dream, that stood over me when I fell. It didn't feel like much time had passed, but I can't explain why. The shadow thing across the way seemed to be looking for something, looking for me. And suddenly it turned. I could see it properly still, but I knew it was looking right at me. It was like I could feel it looking at me. I moved across the clearing and into the trees slowly, but with purpose, heading straight for me. I huddled into the dirt, but I knew it would do no good. Behind me, or maybe to my right, something else moved. I turned to look and I saw a woman. She was naked and she was covered in a red fluid that saturated the moss. And she didn't look quite right. Somehow, like her face, like it was off or something. Then she pounced, snatching my right arm and dragging me under the moss with all of the crawling things, and I woke up. I can't explain why I did what I did next. I suppose I had a burning need to know what had happened. To know whether the dreams were just dreams, or if they were real, or what it all meant. And so, after a few more sessions about dissociative memory and another failed effort of hypnotism, I decided I had to take action. I had to go back to the Tarkeen and try to find whatever I had found as an 8-year-old. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The Wicked Scout. Let's get straight into that. When I was little, my grandfather used to tell me stories, like any grandparent does, I suppose. In my case, Grandpa would tell me the stories that had been passed down through his tribe. My grandfather was of indigenous descent, and thanks to shattering effects of the extermination program run by the European settlers, he held a place of esteem within his tribe despite not being pure Aboriginal blood. He died just after I finished high school. We had moved him near us by then, and thankfully that meant I could spend time with him before he passed. During one of my visits, he told me a story he'd never told me before. I never knew why he chose to tell me this one, so out of place with our mythology, but on the flight back to Tasmania, it snuck back into my mind. "Caitlin," he started, "these stories I've told you, they are your heritage, your history. And there are strange things in this land, and those stories try and tell us where those strange things come from. They aren't really real, but they tell us about the land and the people we come from in a way we can easily accept. That isn't to say that our spirits and our demons aren't real. You understand. Just that the stories have been fashioned around them to teach us." He paused, eyes wet and his arthritic hands trembled. "There is another story I should have told you long ago, but it's dark and evil. I was too afraid of what you might learn from it. A story that is real, and maybe it can teach you something one day. Our people have been here for thousands of years, longer than the scientists and the history books will tell you, and longer than we can put into words. Our people have been here since a time when this world was much different, when spirits were far more than myth or legend. Way back in these times, before history even began, our people arrived and began to explore their new home. One elder led his people across a vast body of water and into a thick, dark forest, where they found plentiful food and water. And they settled there, hunting the wallabies and the kangaroos, fishing the rivers and harvesting the bounty of the bush. And many years later, the old elder had passed away, and his sons had been gone too, and the tribe had become restless. A new leader stood in their place, a warrior, still young and strong, but he lacked the wisdom of the previous elders. A medicine man tried to counsel the young elder, but he was headstrong and refused to listen. The tribe suffered as a result. Hunting parties returned with less food, and the harvesters could find only meager crops in the wild bush, and even the fish seemed to be able to slip the nets and traps. The medicine man tried again, but the young elder laughed him off. He said that the animals were becoming more secretive, more scarce, because they had grown wary of people and retreated further into the wilderness. He said that if they pushed further into the forest, into the mountains, they would find more prey. Upon hearing this, the medicine man shook his head. "You are a fool," he said, "but it is the foolishness of youth." He commanded the young elder to sit and listen to a story about the mountains and about the elders who came before him. He told a story of their first elder and how he had woken one night to the sound of whispers. The fire had fallen to a meager glow, and across the camp he saw something looking back at him with two large eyes. The whispering came from all around and even inside of him somehow, and the eyes across the camp seemed to stare straight into his spirit. The darkness shifted and turned away, and the elder felt compelled to follow. How long he followed for, he did not know. The thing he was following hovered just at the edge of his sight, taking him past landmarks that were alien and unfamiliar. All around him he heard the whispering. But more than that, he heard sounds of life like he had never heard before. The ground crawled with long, many-legged insects, larger than any he had encountered. Above him, the sound of huge wings drew his eyes upwards, where he saw bats as large as a man feasting on fireflies the size of a small bird. Or even the trees began to look different, huge and knotted, twisted in ways that seemed unnatural. The elder walked for hours, until he came to a small stone clearing, where the thing before him had stopped. The elder slowly made his way into the clearing, and before his eyes stood something otherworldly, fantastic and terrifying at the same time. He could clearly see the thing he had been following under the light of a pale moon, much larger than it should have been. The creature stood large and tall, far taller than a man, and on its head were 4 twisted horns. Thick, long fur covered it from head to toe, giving it a formless appearance, and it seemed to move on 4 legs like some of the beasts they had left behind on the plains across the sea. As the elder made his way closer, it followed him with his huge black eyes, watery in the moonlight. He suddenly noticed that the land around him had gone quiet, and then the creature spoke. It spoke inside his head and told him that he had come to a sacred place. It said that his people had wandered into a world they could not understand, and that it would destroy them all. The elder shrank with fear and asked the creature what it would have him do. He could not, after all, convince his people to leave such a fertile and hospitable place. The creature replied that his people had taken things that did not belong to them, and that if they did not stop, they too would die. The elder, frightened but fiercely loyal to his people, thought for a moment. He asked the creature if the land on which they had set up their camp belonged to it, and it replied that it did not. It stated that it could keep them safe as long as they avoided the mountains. That, it said, was where the old things lived. The elder asked what the old things were, but the creature told him he could not possibly understand.
They are not of your world,
it told him.
but they will pass through from time to time.
And do you speak for them? The elder asked. The creature replied that it was of the old things. The elder asked what price he must pay to keep his people safe in these lands, and the creature fell silent for a moment.
You must never enter the mountains,
It said.
but that is not all. At the time of the blood moon, you must organize a hunt. You will send 6 hunters, your finest, into the woods when the moon is highest in the sky.
A hunt? The elder said. For what? The creature laughed inside his head.
They will not be the hunters,
It replied.
they will be the hunted. Of 6, 1 will not return, his existence forgotten by this world. In this way, the old things will be satiated.
With this, the creature began to sink into the ground, absorbed by the very earth itself. As it did, it spoke one last time. Remember this, elder. When the blood moon is highest, 6 must enter the forest. If they do not, one way or another, the old things will take their due. When the elder finally made it back to camp the next morning, his people were stunned. He had been missing for 9 nights. The medicine man paused. Here, and looking at the young warrior, in this way, he said, our people have been kept safe. The old things are preparing us for the hunt, ensuring we are keen and hungry. The blood moon will come, and we must send the hunters. The young elder, stubborn and brave, scoffed at the medicine man. Where is this creature? He exclaimed. I will take the hunters, and we will hunt it. The medicine man shook his head. You will kill us all, he said. But the young warrior would not listen. He assembled the warriors and the hunters of the tribe and marched them into the forest, into the mountains. They walked for a full day and into the night, longer than it should have taken to get to the mountains, and some of the men began to feel uneasy. This is wrong, they said. The spirits of this land are misdirecting us. But the young warrior would not be swayed and kept his men walking well into the night. When they finally reached the mountains, the men were seized by a feeling of terror. Around them, voices from all angles, whispering through the thick trees, words that none of them could understand. They tried to turn back, but the young warrior still would not be dissuaded, and he drove them forward. All around them, there were many-legged creatures, crawling and writhing through the brush. They became aware of shadows shifting under the trees, of eyes watching them intently. In the distance, a tree lifted up and slammed back to the earth. No, not a tree. A leg. A leg the size of a tree. A voice filled their heads, and then,
You should not be here,
it said.
For there are things here of which you cannot even conceive.
The young warrior turned and saw the creature described in the story the medicine man had told him. The sight of it filled him with fear, but it was the sense of it that broke him, cold and uncaring, as though he and his hunters were as insignificant as the tiny flies that filled the forests in spring. He began to run. At the same moment, the shifting shadows came spilling out from under the trees and set upon his men, devouring each and every one of them. He ran, and the whispering followed him, through the forest and the writhing shadows. He ran through the streams and swam over rivers. He ran until the skin flayed of the soles of his feet, and still he ran. Eventually, the young warrior saw the sun and stumbled into the safety of the camp, except he wasn't safe. As he reached the center of the camp, he became aware of the silence. Nothing stirred, and nobody greeted him. He cast his eyes left and then right, dread filling him as he realized why. All around the camp, his people hung from the trees. Their blood ran from their feet, staining the ground, and they had been hung from their necks by their entrails. Unable to bear the sight, the young elder fell to the ground and wept. After some time, he began to hear whispering all around him. He welcomed it, knowing that the creature had come to ensure he shared his people's fate. As it entered the clearing, the young warrior stood to face his death, but it didn't come. Instead, the creature spoke again.
"These people were yours,"
it said.
"They were under your protection. Your forebears made a promise, and they honored the old things and upheld it. Now that promise has been broken, and the old things have taken their due, as they too had promised."
"And what of me?" the young man screamed. "You are surely here to kill me, too, so get it over with." The creature did not respond for the longest of times.
"I am not here to kill you,"
it said.
"I am here to do far worse."
The man trembled at those words, unable to find a response of his own.
"You will not die today,"
the creature continued.
"In fact, you will not die at all. The old things do not suffer a broken pact lightly. By their will, you will walk this world forever, tied both to it and to the world that waits beyond the door, bound to follow the door wherever it may open, never wholly within this world or the one beyond."
The creature then spoke a spell, words that the young elder could not understand, and began to sink once again into the earth. The young elder realized that his wounds had healed, and that he was no longer hungry or thirsty, and he fell to the ground once more and wept. With this gruesome story finished, my grandfather gripped my hand firmly. It was unlike any indigenous myth I'd ever heard, so alien that I thought it must have come from a completely different culture. The story is older than our people. The warrior led his tribe into doom, and no more made the journey across the water for thousands of years. And when they did, the warrior was there, waiting. We call that cursed warrior Maram. It means wicked scout, loosely, in an ancient dialect that died when they wiped out our people. He is the precursor to the appearance of the doorway, and he brings nothing but pain. Wherever Maram goes, you will find the door. Remember that, Caitlin. A few days later, he passed away. I always wonder why it had been so important to him to tell me that story before he went. Why it mattered so much to him that I remembered Maram and the door. On the flight to Hobart, though, I thought of the story and how elements of it matched my dreams. The many-legged creatures, the whispering, the lost time, the trees. It felt so relevant, and my grandfather's telling of the tale had been so pointed that it felt like it had to be related. But how? I thought about what it told me, but I had no idea what it truly meant. If I had, I think I would have turned around and flown straight back home. If I could have, I'm not sure I could have. Something seemed to be waking up inside my mind, and I don't know if I could have resisted it, even if I wanted to. I landed in Hobart with only the barest idea of where to look next. I needed to find someone who could tell me more about the door and the wicked scout that came before it. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. A trapper on the noose. Let's get straight into that. I've been back in Hobart for a few days, trying to find someone to talk to me about the Moram with zero luck. The local indigenous historians and community elders I contacted either had no idea or wouldn't talk to me. I was getting nowhere fast and very frustrated by it, and so I decided to contact an old friend and see if he could help me, even if that meant just bouncing ideas across the table over a coffee. Nathaniel had always been the quiet kid who lived up the street ever since I could remember. We grew up together, went through primary school together, and would probably have gone through all of high school together if we hadn't moved away. Social media kept us barely connected, but we had only spoken rarely over the last 5 years or so. He'd been a somewhat strange kid, curious and with a never-ending imagination. My disappearance fascinated him, and I knew he had all sorts of strange ideas and theories when we were growing up. He stopped all of that when I opened up to him as a young teenager about how hard I found it, being the kid with the childhood trauma, but never really knowing what or why. Still, I thought he might have a different perspective to me, and it would be nice to catch up and focus on something else for a while, anyway. He agreed, but with his work he couldn't get away long enough for a couple of days, and so we planned to meet up in a little bar he knew down by Salamanca that evening. He had grown taller than I remembered, more athletic, but he still had the same sharp eyes and goofy smile. We ordered a glass of wine and sat down on a quietish table outside, and caught up for a while. And eventually the conversation turned to my reason for coming back after so many years. I told him everything about my dreams, a dissociative memory, my grandfather, Moram and the door, and my need to find out what really happened 20 years ago. I told him I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me work it all out, and I thought of him first. Nathaniel listened intently, smiled when I finished, and got up to order a bottle of wine before returning to the table with the sun setting all around us. He poured us both a glass and then sat back for a moment, thinking. You weren't the only one who disappeared around that time, Caitlin. What do you mean? Well, you know how I used to be obsessed with stuff like that, right? When you moved away, I kind of took it back up again. While you were here, I kept my curiosity focused on other stuff so that I didn't upset you. But once you were gone, I think I just naturally gravitated back to it. Anyway, I eventually found that there were more disappearances in that area around the same time. 6 of them over a 6-month period, which is much higher than the average. There are people who go missing in the bush all the time, but not that many, and not that regularly. 7 people went missing in those 6 months, and once we take you into account, only 1 ever came back. Oh my God. Now, for whatever reason, you came back when the others didn't. I did some digging. Basic stuff, obviously. But it seemed like the only connection was the area. I've even spoke to some relatives of 2 of the missing, but they couldn't really point me towards anything concrete. I know you're right, though. I know there's more to this than just a little girl wandering off into the bush. But what could it be? I have no idea, but I have a good reason to suspect something bizarre. He pulled out his phone, typed at the screen for a few moments, and then placed it on the table in front of me. Your story, and the blood moon. You went missing in the first week of November. The others went missing over the rest of the 6-month period that started from there. 2 weeks before you went missing in September, when there was a total lunar eclipse. Holy shit. Maybe it's not related, but when did you start having trouble sleeping? Not when you noticed the nightmares. I think it's clear they started before that, and it might be why you had so much of a problem sleeping. Last winter sometime, I think. Maybe around August? I went for a little while before. I brought it up with the therapist. But I know I started my sleep diary in September. Oh fuck, you don't mean... 27th of July. The longest lasting lunar eclipse so far this century. I got up early. I watched it setting. I took crappy photos of it. You don't think that somehow that set something off in my mind? Oh, I'm not sure, but it's a decent coincidence. I gulped my wine and held it out for a refill, floored by the synergy of it. The story of Maram placed a genuine significance on a blood moon, a name we've given a lunar eclipse for ages, and I've gone missing 2 weeks after an eclipse. I'd potentially started having my nightmares, or dissociative memories, or whatever they were, after witnessing a lunar eclipse. That couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Nathaniel had this intense look in his eyes, concern mixed with excitement. His natural curiosity had never left him, and in the time it took to drink 2 glasses of wine, we rekindled all of the mystery around my original disappearance. Nate, this is crazy. Maybe I'm just going out of my mind, but it feels like there's really something to this. I've got this, I don't know, this sense that went off when I remembered the story. And it's going off now. I just feel like this stuff is at least taking me in the right direction. I have someone I want you to talk to, if you're up for it. I nodded quickly. Of course, I need to get to the bottom of this. I took another big gulp of wine, which didn't help my spinning head. Nate, will you help me with this? If you can. If you have the time, I mean. He grinned that goofy grin. I'm shocked you even have to ask. We raised a glass and laughed, but behind the smile and a sense of relief that I would have someone else along for the ride, my stomach churned. Even then, I knew that I was about to start down a road that I wasn't sure I should be travelling. The weekend came and Nate's workload eased off completely. His project had been delivered and he'd taken some time off to help me with a search for answers. We met up at my hotel early on Saturday morning, piling far too much stuff into his car and setting off to meet with the man Nate wanted me to see. Mark Rutherford lived on an acreage in practically the middle of nowhere, his old weatherboard house backing onto the forests and lakes of the Great Western Tiers. As we pulled up, we were greeted by an exuberant and friendly German shepherd whose excited yips summoned a great-haired man from the house. Nate described him as a historian of weird things, and his appearance suddenly fit the bill. He looked academic, bookish with thick glasses, but his grey hair hung loose and long around his shoulders, giving him a bit of a mad scientist vibe. He had a wide, welcoming smile, though, and he greeted us warmly. Nathaniel, it's good to see you again, lad. You must be Caitlin. It's an honour to meet you at last. He ushered us inside and directed us to sit on one of 4 armchairs scattered around a table piled high with papers and books. Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee? Beer? It's the weekend. I won't judge. We both settled for coffee, and Mark joined us in the lounge room. So, what can I do for you this time, Nate? I think I can guess at some of it, given who you've brought to see me. But let's start with the basics. Well, we talked about Caitlin's disappearance before, and the others at the same sort of time. But there's more now. Mark raised an eyebrow, and Nate gestured at me. I think I might have started to remember some of the things about what happened to me. Mark expelled a breath in surprise, or maybe satisfaction, and sank back into his chair, assuming a kind of pose a therapist might. I told him everything I told Nate, including the stuff about the eclipses, while he listened intently. When I finished, he took off his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully on his shirt. Wow, there's a lot there, honestly. Where do we begin? He closed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose, collecting his thoughts. Okay, let's start with some background. Generic stuff. Tasmania has always been different to the rest of Australia somehow. There are places all over the country where strange things happen, but in Tasmania it's an undeniable hotspot. We've got it all. The most famous UFO event in the country at Kettering. Thousands of ghost stories, strange creatures, strange places like the Southwest Wilderness. And that's just scratching the surface. And of course, disappearances. And some of those are to be expected, for sure. And rugged country and dodgy weather will always increase the average. But the fact is, if you sit down and do the research, there are more unexplained disappearances here than anywhere else in the country. He talked about his work cataloguing Tasmanian folklore and other strange stories and encounters from the University of Tasmania, and he went into some detail about the statistics of some of these encounters before coming to my story. Now, this brings us to your case. I doubt you remember being so young, but it caused quite a stir at the time, and it's never really gone away. And there are still people with loads of different theories. I probably see a reference to it on a forum somewhere, at least once a month. I had really picked up some of the missing 411 stuff out in the US, if you saw any of that. Anyway, that particular string of disappearances always intrigued me, and I could never work it out. But you've rattled a few things loose in this old brain of mine. Why don't we start with your story, the one your grandfather told you? Sure. Have you heard it before? Not exactly, no. But there are familiar elements to it. For example, I have heard mentions of old things several times before. The one that stands out is in a story that I believe originally came from the early settlers in the Savage River area. The two brothers who lived out of a cabin met a luckless trapper who invited him to stay with them for a few days in exchange for a few of his furs. Now back then, there was a loose community of widespread people trying to make a go of it out of the frontier. And so, a couple of days later, a neighbor from a couple of miles away rode over to ask for help moving some fallen trees. Instead, he found both brothers dead. I won't go into detail that the person I heard it from did, but suffice to say that they were killed with an axe and apparently a lot of rage. Even stranger, the few animals they had brought with them were all killed too, gutted and spread out over the ground in a rough circle. The man returned with a search party and it didn't take him long to find the trapper. He was sitting in a small clearing on a flat stone, totally naked and covered in dried blood. It seemed like he had been there for a while. They arrested him and he didn't resist. He also refused to speak, simply responding to any questions with a strange, absent grin. The men thought he must have lost his mind. They sent him to a town several days' ride away for a constable, but he couldn't get any more out of the man. With no real option and a very clear law, they decided that, insane or not, he clearly murdered the brothers, and therefore he would hang. Oh my God. As he went to the gallows, the trapper kept that same absent smile. The only time he struggled was when they tried to put a blindfold on. In the end, they decided not to bother, and they slipped a noose over his neck. Finally, the trapper reacted. He laughed. The few people who had come to the execution didn't know what to do, and the trapper kept laughing. And eventually, he spoke. He told them that he had done what the old things required him to do. and that they would all meet the same fate no matter what they did to him. He told them that the old things were waking up, and that he was glad to die before they did. In the middle of the rant, one of the men kicked his feet out from under him, and they say the smile never left his face. Jesus. I was enough to drive settlers away eventually. The events with the trapper and the murder started it, but they said that the bush out there was darker than anywhere else, and stranger. And of course, you have to remember that this is anecdotal evidence. Records from that time were poor anyway, and not much survived from places like that, especially. But hearing your story mention the old things in a completely different cultural context is very interesting. Okay, said Nate. But what do you know about the eclipses? Or Maram? Or some kind of door? I'm getting there, Mark responded with a chuckle. This stuff is complex. There's a lot going on here. Ah, my bad. There are a couple of things you'll need to leave with me for a bit. Lunar eclipses are all well and good, but whether they relate to a pattern or not, I can't say without researching it. The old things ring more than one bell, but I'll need to remember where from. The name Maram is not familiar to me immediately, but I feel like I've heard it before. I've heard thousands of stories over the years, although admittedly not as many indigenous legends. So many of those have been lost. He shook his head sadly. Now, the door. Well, that's interesting. Although it's vague and it's the first time I've heard anything like that referenced in Tasmania. I have heard stories about something like that when I was trying to establish a link between some of the indigenous folklore here and on the mainland. Except they called it a gateway. I remember that it felt incongruous. Not to put too fine a point on it, but these people didn't even have a word for the gate in their native language, or door for that matter. I thought they must have just been using an English word to loosely describe something, but they told me that the gate had been there long before white settlement. They said the word they used was Ubura Ka, borrowed from a language that preceded theirs. It means the path of misery, or the path of the wicked, depending on who you ask. Nate looked put off, but he tended to want to believe in some of the strangeness of the world. I didn't necessarily see any of this as definitive, even if I felt like something within me agreed. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything, does it? There are a lot of myths and legends out there. Surely some are going to overlap? Sure they will. They do. Hundreds of Aboriginal myths line up. But in 40 years I have only ever heard this mentioned once. Maybe twice if we accept that your story is related. Which, even though it is anecdotal, seems likely. Think about it. What would you say the odds are of two tribes on either side of the Bass Strait, both having a myth that references the same basic thing? And when that thing does not have a word in their languages. This is history, not so much science. Anecdotes are often all we have, especially doing something this obscure. So, while I can't say they're definitely related, I can say that it seems likely. Like what? What is the door, or the Uberaka, or whatever you call it? I couldn't tell you. This myth is ancient, way older than anything else they remember. They know that the gate is no longer there. They don't know when, but it moved. That seems to fit with your story, too. The creature tells Maram that he will be bound to the door wherever it goes. This tribe also believed that the gate was the source of many evil spirits. Old things, maybe. It bears some more research, I think. With that, he told us he would be in contact as soon as he had anything, waving an arm vaguely at the massive pile of papers and books on the table and the shelves that lined the walls. I didn't feel like he ushered us out, but he made it clear that if we wanted answers, we were going to have to let him work on it, which I didn't mind. I had my own things to do, too. I felt it was time for me to go back to the place it all began, even if I found nothing. Nate and I said our goodbyes and headed off, eventually moving northwest. I didn't know what I expected to find, if I just wanted to break through a barrier for my own reasons, but as the dark forest closed back around us, I must admit I felt more than a little nervous. And for the first time in over 20 years, I settled in for the trip to the Tarkine wilderness. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The 4 horns of Janala. Let's get straight into that. The Tarkine isn't as large as the other wilderness areas in Tasmania, although it's right up there. It's also not as remote overall. Bordering the coast along its northern edge means that it can be easily accessed by many of the residents and tourists who enjoy the north coast. It makes up for that with a wide range of terrain. Swamps and grasslands share the same national park as small, rugged mountain valleys and thick, dense, ancient rainforest that wouldn't be out of place in a fantasy novel. The southern edge of the wilderness is far more remote than the north, and with very few visitors outside of serious hikers and the parks and wildlife rangers. This southern edge is closer to where I eventually ended up in 1997, but we were in the north when I disappeared, and so that's where we started. We entered the wilderness as near as I could to where my parents had gone on that trip. The actual entrance to the tracks had changed over the years, moving east, but the tracks are still very much the same, and we quickly found the right path. Anywhere in Tasmania, the weather can change in a split second, and we were reminded of that early on in the first day of our hike. Nate and I set out under the clear skies and warm sunlight, winding our way along the path that took us through clumps of forests and open meadows of green and red grasses. Within an hour, the sun had retreated behind a grim black clouds. The temperature had dropped into single digits, and we were being drenched by freezing rain. And the rainforest provided some shelter, the thick canopy of leaves and intertwining branches blocking out a bit of the rain, but the path had become treacherous. Every step brought the risk of slipping on the slick rocks or the ever-present moss, and as we trekked deeper, the terrain became more rugged. We were descending into a small valley, and the rain had created a heavy mist that seeped into every nook and cranny of the forest. Eventually, late in the day, tired and cold and soggy, we came to an overhang and decided we should settle in for the afternoon and try to wait out the rain. I didn't keep us totally dry, but a hastily erected tent fixed that, and a gas camping heater and stove slowly started to thaw us out and dry our sodden socks. And over a cup of tea, Nate grilled me about how the whole trip made me feel. I'm okay, really. I was pretty anxious about the whole trip, but apart from being a little jumpy, I'm fine. I'm glad I'm not out here alone, though. And have you had any, I don't know, epiphanies or flashbacks or whatever? Nothing. None of this looks familiar, which I guess isn't really unexpected. I'm not sure I thought I'd really recognize anything from when I was 8. Honestly, I'm not really sure what I expected at all. I don't think we should be expecting anything. Just enjoy the trip. If that's the only thing that comes out of this, then at least you've beaten a demon or two of your own and taken another step towards putting all of this behind you, right? I guess. Anyway, we've only gone a little way. I think we were further in when it happened. I'm not going to get too disheartened. I didn't mention it at the time, but based on my dreams and the stories, I had started to believe more than I would have liked. I wouldn't have been at all disheartened if nothing happened. We bounced what we had learned from Mark back and forth as the dull grey skies started turning dark. The rain slowly eased off, leaving a glistening forest wreathed in fog. It was beautiful, and I found myself feeling glad that I had come. A sense of peace settled over me as we talked and laughed in the darkness of the forest. And for the first time in months, I slept easily. We entered a clearing the afternoon of the next day, and I froze. My gaze had settled on a very unique tree, one that seemed to split at right angles midway up the trunk as though it had once been cleaved down the middle and continued growing. I suddenly felt like all the air had been expelled from my lungs, and I swayed as a wave of nausea swept over me, and I knew that tree. Nate quickly turned back and put an arm around me. "Whoa, are you okay? What is it?" And he followed my eyes to the tree. I wanted to climb it, but Mum and Dad said no. I love climbing trees. It made me feel like a superhero, and this one looks so cool. But they thought the moss on the branches might make me fall. I felt really hard done by it, and I sulked around while they started to set up camp. The tent, it would have been over that side of the clearing, near the big rocks. I sat there and I watched them. And I pointed to the rock pile that kept the forest at bay on the right-hand side of the small clearing. For some reason, that pile of rocks made me shudder unconsciously, discomfort crawling up my spine. Nate hugged me, concerned. "I feel like there's more, but I just can't remember. It's so frustrating. I know it's there, but it's like it's behind a door or something. Something I haven't got the key to." An appropriate choice of words, I suppose. Maybe we should set up here for the night. Yeah, maybe. I couldn't help but being drawn to that pile of rocks. I noticed, as I looked closer, a small trail leading into the forest behind it. A game trail, maybe? Or an old, overgrown track. "Hey, Nate, let's walk down that little track for a bit, see if anything else sticks out." He peered into the secluded brush. Sure, if we can get anywhere along it. Why don't we head down there and see what we can see and then come back and camp here tonight?" I agreed and headed towards the tiny game trail with purpose. My stomach twisted in knots and I wanted to try and work myself into ignoring it. Before I realized it, I ducked under the foliage and into the forest. A few meters in, the path opened up enough that we could at least stand. Further down, a flash of brown fur put me on edge for a moment before I realized that we'd startled a small group of panda melons and set them bounding off into the brush. Clearly, the trail was still well used by the local wildlife. And beyond that, though, it looked like a bit of a waste of time. We walked for about an hour and a half, but the forest all looked the same off the main trail. Very few things stood out the way the split tree and the rocks had in the clearing, and my memory stayed fuzzy and frustrated. I almost decided to give up and head back when I saw something just off of the path. And to my right, I spotted a small clearing through the trees, strangely bare of vegetation. I felt somehow drawn to it. As I stepped through the forest and into the open space, the sounds of the bush seemed to fade away. The reason for the lack of vegetation became clear immediately. Underfoot, the ground was actually an immense slab of stone, maybe the top of a flat rock, mostly buried in the earth. Apart from a covering of seemingly ambiguous lichen, some moss and scattered leaves, it prevented anything from growing. More than that, though, it gave the whole space an eerie feeling, somehow detached and removed from the rest of the forest. I felt different, and I remembered that feeling, thinking I'd entered a magical place. And then a word popped into my head. "Yanala." Behind me, Nate reacted to my whisper. What was that?" "I'm not sure. It just came to me." "Okay. When you walked into here, you mean?" I nodded. Do you think it's important? Yes, but I can't tell you why. I mean, I feel like it's important, but I can't remember anything about why it would be. It's just a word that my brain shouted out when I came into this spot. I tried to cross the clearing and see if I could get anywhere on the other side, but the forest kept me firmly within the stone area as well as any wall. Nate, on the other hand, looked down, and while I tried to breach the thick old-growth forest, he knelt down and brushed away the leaves from something in the middle of the stone slab. "Caitlin, look at this." He crouched over something in the center of the clearing, a pattern or a carving in the stone. I could see it even from a few meters away and partly obscured by the moss that Nate had started to pull out of the lines. As he did, the pattern became clearer. I had no doubt that it had been carved by human hands at some point in history. The lines weren't natural, and the way it was weathered spoke to the age of it. Tasmanian Aborigines were known to carve more often than most of the mainland compatriots, although this shape looked different to any of the carvings my grandfather had ever shown me. Nate finished scraping away the moss from half of the carving and stood back, trying to get a sense of what we were looking at. The carving spanned out about 3 meters. I couldn't be sure which way it had originally been oriented, but it was simple enough. A large circle with a pair of eyes and then what looked like 4 legs. I guessed it must have been some sort of simple animal representation. I couldn't put my finger on why, but that carving made me deeply anxious and uneasy. Nate wanted to stay and check out the rest of the stone for more carvings, but I convinced him to head back to the main track. As we left the stone clearing with its strange carving, I realized that the place felt colder than the rest of the forest. A shiver ran down my spine as we stepped out and onto the game trail, and, for the barest moment, I could have sworn I heard a whisper on the wind. And then we were out of view, and the forest returned to normal again. Later that evening, Nate and I were sitting around the stove cooking. The sun had come out again, and being summer so far south, it still had a way to go before setting. The golden light warmed the still damp forest and filled the air with a thin mist as all that moisture started to evaporate. Glancing around the clearing, I noticed that the sun had cast the rocks by the game trail in the shadow. As those shadows shifted on the breeze, I froze. That rock pile. "Caitlin, you've been staring over there for like 2 minutes. Is everything alright?" "No, Nate," and turned back to him, aware of the tears that had started forming in my eyes, and he seemed taken aback and scooted closer. "What's wrong?" "Yanala. I remember. Yanala." He sat close, not pushing me to speak about it, but another set of memories bloomed in my mind. "It was by the rocks. Mum and Dad were setting up the tent and they wouldn't let me climb the tree, and so I climbed up the rocks instead and sat there. Around the other side, I couldn't see them, not really. I was soaking about the tree and didn't even want to see them, and so I sat there for a while. And then I saw something down in the shadows. I couldn't really make out what it was, but I thought it must have been an animal or something. It was black and furry, maybe like a devil, but it seemed pretty big. I was curious, and so I said hello. You know how kids are." "Okay, then what?" It said hello back. Well, that seemed completely normal to me as a kid. It asked me what I was doing, and I said we were camping. I asked it why it was hiding, and it told me that it wasn't hiding. I just couldn't see it properly. I don't think it knew what that meant, and so I asked if it was magic. It said that it supposed it was. I took a deep breath, my throat tightening with a combination of tears and terror, and Nate squeezed my shoulder. I asked it what its name was, and it told me that it didn't have one. I said something about everything having a name, and it said that really only new things had names, which I didn't really understand. It said that it had been called many things, and it told me that people like me used to call it Yanala, and that I could too. I said that was a funny name. It said it was a name for a messenger. And then it told me that I should be careful, and I thought I had offended it. But then it said that things were waking up. Bad things. Yanala told me that I wasn't one of the ones they were looking for, and that I should go back to my parents. And then I don't know, it stood up, and I saw it. I looked over at my parents and I fucking followed it into the forest, Nate. I started crying then. The emotion of the memory and the feeling like I was living it for the first time again overwhelmed me. Nate did all he could. He hugged me and just let me cry it out. The memories only really seemed to go a little bit further, but I guess knowing now that something completely outside of the world of normal things had happened to me sent me over the edge a little bit. I settled down after a while and felt like I needed to finish. I followed the Yanala into the bush, down the game trail, but it was a slightly different trail then. It ran straight into the clearing, the one with the stone carving. And by the time we got there, it had gotten dark, somehow. It should have only been about 5:30, but the sun had completely gone. I was cold and the forest started to whisper. I'd been sneaking around, but I started to cry, and Yanala heard me. It turned around and I heard it speak again. It sounded sad. It told me that I should not have followed it, and that it could not protect me. And then it vanished into the stone, and I was totally alone. Jesus, Caitlin. That's not the worst of it. I mean, that's pretty much all I could remember for now, but in the clearing, I finally saw Yanala properly. Nate, I was huge and covered in black fur. I couldn't tell exactly what it looked like through all the fur, but it had 4 horns on its head. I drew the symbol from the clearing in the dirt by the stove, upside down, and Nate's eyes widened. A circle, 2 eyes and 4 horns, not legs. The carving is a representation of Yanala, or whatever it really is, and Yanala is the thing from my grandpa's story. I think. Fuck! This is all so crazy, but I think that clearing is where the elder spoke to Yanala in the story. That's what the carving means. He sat back in shock, silent for a moment. Does that mean the stone clearing is the door? I thought about it for a moment, but I didn't think so. I doubt it. The stories say the door or the gate moves. Maybe it was a door at some point, but I don't think so. I think the door itself is something different, and the clearing is something else. But I've got no fucking idea, honestly. I'm not sure I want to keep doing this. Nate, I don't know if we can keep dragging all this stuff up. It's too much. He took my hand but said nothing else. There wasn't really anything else he could say. But I had one more memory I agonized over telling him for a few quiet moments. There's one other thing. When the Yanala disappeared and I thought that I was alone, I wasn't. I remember noticing that the ground was suddenly covered with crawling things, but there was something else. A horrible thing, like a shadow. It rose from the other side of the clearing, and it had these smoking purple eyes. It looked at me and laughed. I just ran. I think that thing was Marum, Nate. What makes you think that? Because of what it said as I ran away. I had tears in my eyes again. the fear fresh in my chest as though everything had just happened that day. It said I could run as fast and as far as I liked, but it wouldn't matter. It said the door was opening and the old things were coming. Wow, 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 wow. And another one. Wow. Absolutely riveting stuff. A wonderful tapestry of chills and mystery. From the absolutely awesome CreepyAus. As ever guys, please do take a second to head over to CreepyAus' Reddit and hit the upvote button, or possibly leave a nice comment thanking them for their incredible penmanship. It really does go a long way for helping them build a profile on the Reddit platform. Of course, as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. I hope you're all doing wonderful this week and enjoying a nice restful weekend, hopefully with friends and family. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.